Hello there, welcome back to the channel. My name is James, and here at 20th and 21st Movies, we are about all things cinema. Well, I am really excited today to continue my Taste of Director series. This is a series where I focus on directors, and so what I do in each of these videos is I'll choose a specific director and I'll focus on 3 to 4 films from her or his filmography, and just to give a taste of that director's work. So choosing only a few films from a director's filmography may seem like that's only a small sample size of the director's work. In many cases it is, but it at least gives a taste of what that director has to offer. In today's video, I am really excited to share my favorite director of all time. So I have a fairly long list of favorite directors. They include folks like Stanley Kubrick, Brian De Palma, Quentin Tarantino, Christopher Nolan, Spike Lee, Catherine Bigelow. The list goes on and on. There's so many fantastic directors, many of which I haven't even named. But of all my favorite directors, there's one director that stands just a notch above all the rest for me, and that is none other than Sir Alfred Hitchcock. Alfred Hitchcock is responsible for many films over a multi-decade career spanning from the 1920s in England all the way up to the 1970s. And this man has put out some tremendous films over the decades. And I have the pleasure today to focus on 4 films from this great director's filmography. The Man Who Knew Too Much from 1934, Notorious from 1946, Vertigo from 1958, and Psycho from 1960. Born in 1899 in Leytonstone, Essex, a suburb northeast of London, England, Alfred Hitchcock was the youngest of 3 children. He had an older brother, William, and an older sister, Eileen, to parents of both English and Irish descent. As a teenager, he worked at a telegraph company as an estimator, and it's around that time that he developed his interest in and became fond of movies, and he frequented the cinemas of that day. Alfred Hitchcock was raised Catholic and he attended St. Ignatius College, and then shortly after college, around 1920, he entered the film industry and shortly thereafter met Alma, who would become his wife. He made a few films in the early 1920s, all leading up to his first feature film in 1927 called The Lodger. So part of understanding Hitchcock's filmography is looking at it in 2 eras. The first era being his time working for Gaumont British Picture Corporation, where he produced films in Britain in his early period in the 1920s up to the late 1930s. He then moved to Hollywood around 1939, I believe. And from there, he started making his films in the United States, starting with Rebecca, which won Best Picture in 1940. And Rebecca is the only Alfred Hitchcock movie, surprisingly enough, to have won Best Picture. So Rebecca was his first film in the United States. He also released that same year in 1940, Foreign Correspondent, which is also an excellent film from Alfred Hitchcock. You see the influences of the films that he made in England on the films that he made in his time in Hollywood, how he honed his skills in the early days of his career in England, and how that really came to full fruition throughout his career and in the films that he produced in the United States. So from the period of the 1920s all the way up to the 1970s, Sir Alfred Hitchcock made nearly 50 films over that long career. So he is one of the most prolific directors of all time, and I am excited to share a taste of just a few of the films from his filmography. So let's go ahead and get started with the first film that I'll talk about here. So this is The Man Who Knew Too Much from 1934, starring Leslie Banks, Edna Best, and Peter Lorre, pictured on here. And this film is basically about a family that is vacationing in Switzerland. Their daughter gets kidnapped by Peter Lorre here, who is leading a band of spies, and they're plotting an assassination attempt. So this is a really fascinating film from Alfred Hitchcock. Really gives you a glimpse into the early days of his career. Again, this is from 1934, so it's during the early days where he was working for the Gaumont British Picture Corporation. I've included this film in particular because this film is really what launched his career. Now, his first feature film was 1927's The Lodger, but this film is what really kind of got him launched and ultimately led to him a few years later moving to Hollywood and making films in the United States. But this is a fantastic film. I highly recommend it. This is an absolutely fantastic addition from the Criterion Collection that I highly recommend. It's got a nice booklet on the inside, The Man Who Knew Too Much. You see back here, the back there. Just a fantastic, fantastic film. The little girl here who was kidnapped was played by an actress named Nova Philbin, and her performance in this is fantastic. So this is just a great film from Alfred Hitchcock. It's The Man Who Knew Too Much, starring Leslie Banks, Edna Best, and Peter Lorre, as well as Nova Philbin. So this is a film I would highly recommend to someone who is just starting to get into Alfred Hitchcock's filmography. You're wondering, where's a good place to start? I would recommend picking up The Man Who Knew Too Much. This is a great way to start watching Alfred Hitchcock's films. Ultimately, you really can't go wrong with whatever you choose in his filmography. This is Hitchcock, but this is a great place to start. The Man Who Knew Too Much from 1934. Check it out. All right, next on the list is a film from 1946, starring one of my favorite actors of all time, Cary Grant, as well as Ingrid Bergman and Claude Rains, and that is Alfred Hitchcock's Notorious. This is a film from 1946, and this is an absolutely fantastic film. This is a Criterion Collection edition, of course. This film came out in 1946, and this Criterion is actually spine number 137. So the Blu-ray Upgrade came out recently, I think a couple of years ago, and this is an absolutely amazing film from Alfred Hitchcock that I highly recommend. So this film stars Cary Grant as a U.S. agent named Devlin. He basically recruits Ingrid Bergman's character, Alicia Huberman, whose father was recently put in prison. Devlin recruits her to spy on a Nazi industrialist who's hiding out in South America. Claude Rains plays the Nazi industrialist spy that's hiding out in South America. And this is just a fantastic spy espionage type thriller that I highly recommend. This is the 75th anniversary of this film that came out in 1946. And this is, to me, one of Alfred Hitchcock's best films. So if I had to rank Alfred Hitchcock's top films, I may do a video on that at some point in the future. This would be very near the top. And quite honestly, there are many people that feel that this is his best film. That's an argument for another day, but this is an absolutely fantastic film, and this is a great addition from Criterion that I highly recommend. There's a couple of things to note about this film. This particular scene here with the key is very important, and one of the things that you'll see in this film, which is indicative of Alfred Hitchcock's techniques, is how he creates suspense in a scene. There's a crane shot about 1 hour into this film that, to me, really symbolizes why Alfred Hitchcock is just one of the great directors of all time. It's a crane shot that takes place about an hour into this movie and is so integral to the plot and integral to setting up the scene and building the tension and suspense and telling the story of what's going on. And it is just masterful filmmaking at work. So I highly recommend Notorious. The acting in this film is absolutely off the charts. Cary Grant, Ingrid Bergman, Claude Rains, all putting in fantastic performances. The actress who played Claude Rains' mother in this film is fantastic. This is just a great piece of filmmaking, directing, acting, all the way around. This is a fantastic film from Sir Alfred Hitchcock that I highly recommend. It's one of his best films. It's called Notorious from 1946. Check it out. All right, so the first few films I talked about were from the earlier days of Alfred Hitchcock's filmography. These next two films are from a little bit later in his filmography. Those first two films are films that are fantastic films, but in one way or another, you could probably interchange those films. For example, The Man Who Knew Too Much, I could have probably included The Lady Vanishes instead, or I could have included The Lodger or 39 Steps or a couple of other films from his British period instead of The Man Who Knew Too Much. For Notorious, I could have chosen Rebecca instead, which would have been an excellent choice to include in this discussion, or I could have gone with Foreign Correspondent. For these last two films though, I don't think there was really any negotiation in which two films I needed to include. If I'm only going to include 4 films in this discussion, these are two films for which there is no replacement in my mind in Alfred Hitchcock's filmography. And they're two of the films that are featured in the Alfred Hitchcock Classics collection. And the first of these films that I'll talk about is Vertigo from 1958, and then I'll talk about Psycho from 1960. In my mind, any discussion of Hitchcock has to include those two films. The first two films I talked about, The Man Who Knew Too Much and Notorious, Like I said before, you could replace another film from Alfred Hitchcock's filmography and have a great discussion and include these other two films. But there is no replacing the importance of Vertigo and Psycho to understanding Alfred Hitchcock. And so this is Alfred Hitchcock's Classics Collection. This is the 4K Ultra HD release that came out last year that I did an unboxing of that you may want to check out on this channel. But this is an absolutely fantastic box set. I have not done a review of this box set on this channel, but I hope to do that someday. But starting off with Vertigo. Vertigo is from 1958 and it stars Jimmy Stewart, Kim Novak, and Barbara Geddes in basically a descent into madness for Jimmy Stewart's character, Scotty. He's basically tricked by an old associate of his to follow a woman. He falls in love with her, and it leads to his descent into madness as he gets caught up in this web of deceit and trickery. And it's just a fantastic, amazing film that is scored by the legendary Bernard Herrmann, who collaborated with Hitchcock on a number of films. It's one of the most iconic movie soundtracks of all time, the soundtrack for Vertigo, and it supports the dramatics of the film incredibly well. But Vertigo is just an amazingly disorienting thriller with twists and turns that will keep you guessing all along the way. It's just great direction by Hitchcock, great acting by Jimmy Stewart and Kim Novak and everyone that's involved. And it's just one of the greatest films of all time. If you have not seen Vertigo, if you've just heard of Vertigo and you're wondering what's all the hoopla about, do yourself a favor and check out Vertigo. Especially if you can get your hands on this set and see it in 4K Ultra HD on a 4K television. Universal did a great job restoring all four of these films. I think Vertigo is probably the best picture quality of all the four films on this set. It's a tie between Vertigo and Psycho maybe, but they did a great job restoring all four of these films, putting them on 4K discs, and they look better than they have ever looked. So I highly recommend checking out Vertigo if you have not seen that film. It stars Jimmy Stewart, Kim Novak, Barbara Geddes, a great cast, and I cannot recommend it enough. It is a film that, to me, will forever be attached to Alfred Hitchcock. It's just one of his greatest films, and it's also one of the greatest films of all time. So that's Vertigo from 1958. Highly recommend checking out that film. All right, so the last film that I'll talk about in this Taste of Hitchcock, this director series where I talk about a particular director. Today I'm talking about my favorite director, Alfred Hitchcock. This last film that I'll talk about is a film that I think most people think about when they hear the name Alfred Hitchcock, and that is Psycho from 1960. When you hear the name Alfred Hitchcock, most people think, oh, Psycho, right? And Psycho is an amazing film from Alfred Hitchcock, but it's important to understand that Psycho is just one of many films that Alfred Hitchcock produced over a multi-decade career, starting in the 1920s in Britain all the way up to his American films. Psycho is a brilliant masterpiece of a film starring Anthony Perkins, Janet Leigh, and Vera Miles, and it is an absolutely extraordinary film that I cannot recommend enough. Psycho is just a fantastic film all the way around. To me, it's one of the greatest films that I've ever seen. It's one of the greatest films ever made. It's included in many film critics' top films of all time. So it is a highly regarded film, and for good reason. This film, Psycho, is, in my mind, probably as close to a perfect film as any film I've ever seen. From the standpoint of pacing, direction, cinematography, acting, setting the scene, direction, editing, all the aspects of filmmaking came together as close to perfection as I've ever seen in this one particular film. Psycho is an absolutely brilliant film, and it's one of Alfred Hitchcock's masterworks. There's one particular scene, of course, many of you may be familiar with it. It's the shower scene. That scene, the way that it was shot, edited, and put together and sequenced, it's probably one of the most studied scenes in film schools. I mean, it is an absolute masterclass in filmmaking, how that scene was shot and edited. It's an example of what I would consider to be nearly perfect filmmaking in the way that that scene was executed. It is just absolutely brilliant. And this film, from an acting standpoint, with Anthony Perkins and Janet Leigh, is just absolutely phenomenal, the way that they played those characters. I don't want to spoil the plot and the details too much. This is a film that you need to experience for yourself. If you have not seen Psycho, I highly, highly recommend it. The story of Norman Bates is legendary in film history, and is something that you need to see for yourself. And a really nice companion piece with Psycho is a TV series called Bates Motel, which came out just a few years ago, starring Vera Farmiga and Freddie Highmore playing Norman and Norma Bates. It is an absolutely brilliant series that aired on AMC a few years back. You can catch it on Blu-ray, maybe on streaming somewhere. That is a great companion piece to Psycho because that basically gives you the backstory. It's like a prequel to this Psycho movie that came out in 1960. So if you have not seen Psycho, if you have not seen Bates Motel, if you like binge watching and you want something to really sink your teeth into and get into the lore of an interesting story, and you want to pair a great movie with a great TV series that's related to it, I highly recommend watching Psycho and then watching Bates Motel, the TV series. Highly, highly recommended. So Alfred Hitchcock is known as the master of suspense. A lot of his films dealt with suspense and thriller elements, and he was the master of building suspense and tension in his films. And when you see his films, you understand why he's called the master of suspense. Alfred Hitchcock was also uniquely skilled in mixing in humor and comedy in his thrillers and suspense movies. Some of the common themes that you'll see in Alfred Hitchcock films are some of the fears that he had, such as the fear of the police, the fear of heights, the fear of being, up high and looking low and seeing, a long drop down. That fear of heights was something that he played on really heavily in a lot of his films, as well as the fear of the unknown. Alfred Hitchcock was a master of weaving those elements together as well and playing on the fear of the police, fear of heights, fear of the unknown. He was a master at mixing those elements into his films. Another element that Hitchcock played on very heavily in a number of his films was the whole wrong man trope, whether it be in North by Northwest or The Man Who Knew Too Much or The 39 Steps, any number of other films. Alfred Hitchcock is known for playing on that trope as well. I believe what makes many directors great is the people that director chooses to work with. It's the people that she or he decides to work with throughout many of the films in their filmography that really help to define their style and their approach to filmmaking. And their decisions around who they work with is really important because most directors are going to choose to work with people that are going to jive with their filmmaking style, what they're trying to convey to the audience. Hitchcock is also known with working some of the greatest actors in the film industry of his day, including Cary Grant, Jimmy Stewart, Ingrid Bergman, and several other amazing actors over his long career. His collaborations with composer Bernard Herrmann with some of his biggest films, such as Vertigo and Psycho, is really emblematic of the importance of working with collaborators that are in sync with your vision of filmmaking, because Bernard Herrmann in those soundtracks really set the mood and really elevated those movies and really supported the narrative and the story making based upon the music that was playing and queuing up certain moments and just setting the mood, building the tension, driving the suspense of the story. Music is such a huge, huge part of filmmaking, and Alfred Hitchcock understood that, and that's why he collaborated with composers like Bernard Herrmann in his movies, because he understood the importance of using music to support and drive the narrative of his stories, and this was executed brilliantly in Hitchcock's films. All right, so there you have it. That's my taste of Hitchcock. This is my latest in my director series, where I talk about a specific director and a few films from that director's filmography. Alfred Hitchcock, like I said before, is my favorite director of all time. I love almost every movie of his that I've ever seen. I love the TV series Alfred Hitchcock Presents from many years back that he did, I believe in the 1960s. I just think that he was one of the most brilliant directors that has ever lived, and I absolutely love his films. Let me know in the comments below, what do you think about Alfred Hitchcock movies? Do you have a favorite Hitchcock film? Also, let me know in the comments below, who is your favorite director of all time? Which director for you stands above all the rest? And where would you rank Alfred Hitchcock in your list of favorite directors? Or would he even appear at all? Well, that's all I have for this one. Thanks again for watching, and we'll look to see you next time at the movies. Peace.